Hello. Oh, wow. You can see your day 3 of the conference. Interactive. Who here has ever met or loved a bisexual person, or maybe even identifies as a bisexual person? Give me a whoop. Woo! Those who didn't give me a whoop, you've definitely met us. We're everywhere. And I'll tell you how research about bisexuality has evolved over the last 150 years. Because the other thing is that although for a long time I think bisexuality is, still being painted as a trend, it is in fact not a trend. Or if it is, then it is a trend that just keeps on giving. So we're going to talk about the history of the term bisexuality, some researchers who really defined the field whom everyone should know, and how the whole concept and research on bisexuality muddies up the binary thinking that we often have when it comes to sexuality, and how that has also led to our exclusion at times. So I identify as bisexual, and by that I mean someone who is attracted romantically and or sexually to multiple genders. So that includes other terms. Bi is an umbrella term for other terms like pansexual, plurisexual, polysexual. What else have we got? Queer sometimes, fluid, bicurious. There's a lot of other words, but as soon as you are sexually and or romantically attracted to multiple genders, I would consider you within the bi plus family. So, let's go through a history that you've never been taught, but should have. And I'm going to start with this quote. So as a German, I like Hermann Hesse's work, and I really like this sentiment going into the next half hour, where sort of surrender yourself, surrender your sort of, also assumptions maybe, and let me take you into these exciting discoveries. So I gave myself up to the ecstasy of discovery. Part 1, the bi closet. So this is where we come to the point where the question is, how many bisexual people do you know? Or have you ever met a bisexual? Because there are a lot of people who, if you ask that in research studies, they say, no, I've never met a bisexual person. And so the question is, well, how many of us are there? And the answer to that is, it's really hard to know. But we know that younger people are identifying more as bi and pansexual. We also know that a lot of people who could use the label don't for various reasons. So a lot of people choose to still call themselves straight or gay, even though technically they are attracted to multiple genders. And there's some issues within that where it's, of course, everybody's choice, but sometimes that comes from a place of biphobia, or an internalized biphobia, because we've been taught that bisexuals just can't pick a side. The middle's a really fun place to be, though. So if you've been taught your whole life that bisexuals are slutty, if you're a woman, right? That's a classic. You're slutty. Can you be serious in a monogamous relationship? Can you possibly commit yourself to one person? That's a classic stereotype, although most bisexual people, if you ask them, are in fact in monogamous and just like other people, hopefully loving relationships. Simultaneously, for men, there's often the assumption that someone who identifies as bi might secretly be gay, and they're just not willing to go all the way. And so there's stereotypes on both sides, and they do differ in terms of the impact that they have on people's lives and how they manifest in terms of things like psychological well-being and things like self-harm and the consequences, the negative consequences that stigma carries. Globally, if we're talking about the LGBTQ sort of closet more generally, 83%, it's been calculated or estimated, 83% of people in the world who are queer are in the closet. Now, quite a lot of those people will be in the closet for safety, because in those countries where they live, it's not allowed, or it's criminalized to engage in homosexual acts. That's usually framed as homosexual acts. Although some countries now who are homophobic or have homophobic legislation, they are seeing the bisexuals. It's like sometimes you don't want the visibility. Sometimes some of the human rights campaigners are now addressing the fact that bisexuality is being written into human rights violations, specifically also targeting bisexual people. So the word bisexual is now being mentioned, not just gay, which for a long time was the main topic. So 83% of LGBT plus people are in the closet. And according to the Bi Report, which is a UK report, which was published in 2020, bi people in the UK, this isn't in countries where it's criminalized, were less than half as likely to be out as gay or lesbian people. Only 20% of bisexual people in 2020 were out to all of their family members, and only 36% were out to friends. That's a problem. And the question we should be asking isn't, why aren't people telling us that they're bi? The question is, why aren't we making the space for people to tell us that they're bi? Why aren't we normalizing the fact that this is an identity and that this comes with its own potential consequences, right? So you are less likely to seek out the queer community if you aren't out to your friends and family, in which case you're also less likely to feel like you are part of something. Like the discrimination or prejudice that you are potentially facing also can be ameliorated by having other people going through the same things. The first time I went to Bi Pride was a few years ago. So in London, there's this organization called Bi Pride, which is relatively young, and they organize this really big festival of bisexuality. And it really feels that way. You've got comedians, you've got activists, you've got people writing stories, you've got fiction authors, people are giving talks, there's dancing. And it's a really incredible space to be, because as a bisexual person, you're so rarely in a space that is made for you, and in a space where you can just show up and you don't need to justify it. No one asks you, but are you sure? Or all of the other annoying questions, and you don't feel like you need to educate. You're on the same page. And anyone who's been to Humanist Convention, perhaps, and who feels like you don't need to justify it here, it's the same feeling, right? Whenever you're part of a minority group, you can get that connection and the buffer effects, the psychological buffer effects that come with that. So, in terms of the UK, bi people are less likely to be out in every aspect of everyday life, whether that is at home, in education, at work, or as part of a faith community. So it's really important to make bisexuality visible and to have pro-bi communication. And so when you have, for example, a panel event, and you've got people who represent different letters within the LGBTQIA+ alphabets, you also want to make sure sometimes you've got a bisexual person, because you are sending a statement by omitting consistently a bisexual person as well. Now, fun question before we move into the history section. What does a bisexual person look like? There has been actual research on this question. So for a long time, when you asked people, so in some of these research studies, children and others were asked, okay, so what does a lesbian person look like? What does a gay person look like? What does a bisexual person look like? I know what you're thinking. This is stigmatizing. It was actually the opposite. The research was on queer visual language. It was on how, if you want to be read or seen as being a part of a community, how do you communicate that to others? Because if you don't have a visual language, it's much harder to see each other, right? And so there is a bit of a, you can look a bit more gay, and so the kids were sort of picking up on stereotypes, of course, but there are things you can do to sort of signal, hey, I'm part of this group. And it's the same with lesbians. And for bisexual people, the kids and everyone else was like, I have no idea. And the problem is that the bisexual people themselves also went, I have no idea. And so how do you find each other out in the wild? And I think the answer has sort of solved itself, because I think the answer, I don't have one, but I think I need one, is septum piercings. I think if you're under 30 and have a septum piercing, good chance you're bi. Maybe not the other way around. If you don't have one, no. But septum piercings are definitely, they've become part of visual language. For a while, it was like cuff jeans. That was a classic. Can't sit in chairs. There's a stereotype of bisexuals can't sit in chairs. They always sit weird. But there are these visual language things that do evolve over time, of course. And we have the bi flag, which you possibly know already. Pink, purple, blue. Often misunderstood as pink represents girls, blue represents boys, and purple is everyone in between. Who knows the correct answer to why the bi flag colors are the way they are? What is the pink for? Homosexuality. Why is it pink? Because of the pink triangle. Because it was a reclaimed symbol of oppression, right? And so the pink in the bi flag references homosexuality. The blue is supposed to represent heterosexuality, and the purple is the gradient between. You're welcome. And it's the same when we talk about bisexuality as an identity. Sometimes it's pegged as liking men and women. But actually, if we look back, we're going to go back in time in bi history, and we go back to the first uses of the term bisexual in a way that is at all remotely close to how we use it now, we see that Havelock Ellis actually used the term bisexual to describe people who were both heterosexual and homosexual. It was never about liking men and women, although of course that was implied because the state of the literature was different at the time. But it was always homo and heterosexual and people who were in the gradients in between. So, The first recorded use of heterosexual and homosexual, did you know this? Was an anonymous pamphlet in 1869. It was later established that Karl Maria Kurt Benny was the author of these German/Austrian pamphlets. So here's one of them from 1880. Is it also distorted on your screen? Is it looking okay? It's looking okay. Yeah. And these were sort of just like, they were pamphlets. So you'd find them on the streets, you'd find them in shops. And initially he was hiding who he was because he didn't want to be convicted of homosexual acts or other kinds of associated crimes. He was also a very colorful character. He committed a lot of actual crimes. So he was kind of on the run most of the time. He spent quite a few days hiding in a cemetery. So if you're ever interested in Karl Maria Kurt Benny, he's a wild character. But in this context, what he wanted to do is he wanted to decriminalize all homosexual acts. And so his introduction of the word homosexual was because he was a gay rights activist. And also the introduction of the word heterosexual. And this is one of my favorite facts from queer history. I know it's not bi-specific, but it's so good, that heterosexuality was invented by a gay man. So good. And so the reason heterosexuality was invented as a term is because, well, what's the other? If we've got homosexuality, we need to have something that is the other. And so hetero, of course, is other sex, and homo is same sex. Then along comes Havelock Ellis. So up to this point, we've got sort of medico-legal scholars who are interested in sexuality and sex. They're particularly interested in the perversions. Mostly doing research on prisoners, for example. And so there's this whole category where it's like, see, all of the queers are criminals. It's like, you're in prisons. This is a select sample. But of course, at a time when you're trying to make a point that homosexuality and homosexual-related identities, although there wasn't really identities yet, that these were bad, obviously that is it's consistent that you pick settings where that is already stigmatized. These are already settings where we sort of ostracize people. And so it's very consistent. And so Havelock Ellis was looking at all these studies going, this is wild that you keep just doing these studies and you're not actually communicating sexuality the way that it is seen. So the thing about Havelock Ellis is his wife, Edith Ellis, she was a feminist and she was working very hard for women's rights. She was also, as Havelock Ellis himself calls, predominantly homosexual. They were in what we would now call ethically non-monogamous relationship, in an open marriage. She lived with her female partner most of the time in an apartment. He lived in his own flat, and he occasionally had sort of flings, but he would describe himself as mostly asexual, which of course now as an identity then wouldn't have been, but he was like, this works really well. And if you go over their correspondences, so they wrote a lot of letters to each other, and a lot of them can still be seen in the Havelock Ellis archive and in his own autobiography. So this is a time of everyone had an autobiography. Everyone had a book called My Life, as did Havelock Ellis. He wrote My Life, apparently 2 weeks every summer at the lake house. He would go and write his autobiography. But it does mean, in terms of preserving the contents of these messages, that you really see the evolution of their love letters. And it's really sweet. And he includes them in his autobiography, basically to prove a point, which is we didn't live separately because we didn't love each other. That had nothing to do with it. We just had other interests and other lives as well. So Havelock Ellis was surrounded by his wife and also one of his best friends, who was identified as a gay man. And so he was gay, and he also thought, well, this guy, he's normal, he's my friend. So he had this queer circle, and so he decided he was going to write a book, and he was going to study sexual orientation, and he wasn't going to go in biased. He was going to go in and say it like it is. And so all he did is he asked people and sourced various sexual histories, and he included them in this magnum opus, the Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Sexual Inversion. There were many volumes. They were about lots of different things. And bisexuality is represented. And so he speaks to people who he calls bisexual, who describe having sexual relations with multiple genders or sexual fantasies relating to multiple genders. And he just presents them. He just sort of goes, here they are, and leaves it. And of course, this meant that when it came out in 1898, it was immediately banned. because how dare you say neutral, it wasn't even positive, but neutral things about queer people. And so it was taken off the shelves. There was a very famous case in queer history called R.V. Bedborough, which is the bookseller who was on trial. And the press called Havelock Ellis's writing and books lewd, bawdy, scandalous, and obscene libel. So good. It went on to become a bestseller within his field. Once the Americans published it, he tried a couple more times. There's, again, lots of drama with publishing this book, but eventually it got out, really defined the field, and has since a little bit been forgotten, which I find sad, because he was one of the first sort of allies in being not himself queer, but being very much a sort of champion is too much, but it was very important to him to neutrally and correctly present in a scholarly way queer identities. And it's some of the first recorded entries about bisexuality. So this is 1898. When did you think bisexuality was first written about as a word? Oh, I was surprised by that. Along comes Freud. We're just going to have a little Freud interlude. I'm not a big Freud fan, as you can see from the slide. Freud, lol. Freud decided, so sometimes people talk to me and they say, oh, no, Julie, but around this time, Freud was writing, and he was writing positively. He said, everybody's bisexual. Everyone is born bisexual. That's what Freud said. It is what Freud said. But you know why? You're not going to like it. Freud said everyone's born bisexual, and then if they go through the psychosexual stages, what do they become? Gay, right. And if they keep developing, what do they become? Straight. So what is bisexuality? Rudimentary sexuality, that's right. Bisexuality is something you're born with, and then you're supposed to grow out of. Basically, he infantilized bisexuality in a very pernicious way. So I just wanted an interlude, because you'll occasionally hear a Freud brought up, and it's like, not a friend. Sounds like a friend, not a friend. But a friend. Let's meet another friend. Alfred Kinsey. You've probably heard of this man. Did you know that he packed out stadiums with his lectures? Look at that picture. Oh, you can't see it. If you could see it. He not only packed out the basketball hall when he published sexual behavior in the human male, he also packed out the next room. So the university in Berkeley, so Berkeley University in 1949, had so many people who were interested in coming to Kinsey's lecture, and these were academic lectures. If you look at Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which was the book that he published in the late 1940s, which became an instant bestseller, by the way, for about a year, it's proper research. There's studies, there's graphs. It's not like pop sci today. This is studies. And people were so interested in seeing what people were doing behind closed doors. How are people having sex? With whom are people having sex? And one of the things he was interested in is also how gender plays into this, and what kinds of genders people are attracted to, and how they manifest in terms of sexual behavior. And so he published his books, and then he found himself selling out, effectively, these basketball halls. So this is a basketball court. They had to bring in all these extra chairs, and this specific one, this is my favorite because this specific one, they had to use the basketball court next door, fill that one with chairs, and it was one of the first radioed lectures. So they had to use radio, like the big speakers here as well. They had speakers in the other one, so people could just listen to him live via this radioed feed. That's how popular he was. This is the 1950s. This is 1949. This is way before. The idea that queer identities are now very hip, come on. Everyone has always cared about these issues, and researchers have cared about these issues, although in various ways. So Alfred Kinsey, very much a friend, and he specifically was interested in describing the complexity of human sexuality as it actually exists. And if you're a scientist, or even scientifically interested, go back and read some of Kinsey's old critiques. The back and forth between Kinsey, he would write so many rebuttal papers. So there'd be a study published on sexuality, once again saying, look at all these queer people, look at all the criminality, look at this perversion, look how bad it is. And he would come at them, and he would write responses and responses and responses, and basically accused everyone consistently of being biased. And they're like, you're just putting your ethical framework onto these data. Kinsey came from the biological sciences, and he's like, I'm not here to judge. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm here to describe. And what y'all are doing, that is not describing. That is imposing a rigid construct onto how you want or think you should be seeing this behavior. So Kinsey was like, that doesn't work. I'm going to create my own scale. And you've probably, who here has seen the Kinsey scale before? Oh, only some. Okay, this is the Kinsey scale. So the Kinsey scale was actually something he used at the time. Now it's quite popular as an online tool as well, where you can answer a bunch of questions, and it sorts you into between 0 and 6, heterosexual to homosexual. I like that 0 is exclusively heterosexual. Something delightful about that. Like, you get more gay the more numbers you get. Not to say that it's a qualitative difference necessarily, but I think it's funny. So 0 to 6, and he also had an X for no sexual interest, which again, for the ace community, this is important history. So 0 to 6, and he would do a long interview. He did thousands and thousands of interviews himself. He also had research assistants helping him. And he would, at the end, categorize people into a number based on all the questions of fantasies, the sexual experiences, relationships people had had. And he would say, okay, I think you're a 3.3. Or I think you're a 5.1. He like decimals. And then he would present this to the person and be like, what do you think? And of course, most people freaked out because almost none of them were exclusively anything. Almost none of them were pure 0s or pure 6s. And that wasn't really on at the time. And so he was like, no, I'm just trying to describe it. Ultimately, his opinion would prevail because he knew there was too much. This couldn't be too much of a negotiation. And so he would say, okay, for the purposes of this study, or as we might say, an operational definition, I'm going to categorize you as this, because that is the best way to represent your reality in our data. And so when he published sexual behavior in the human male, and then subsequently sexual behavior in the human female, which I don't like, has 3 men on the cover, sexual behavior in the human female. It's like 3 men on the cover. But this, again, like sign of its time, if you open that cover, there's about 6 women listed as co-authors. So there were a lot of women who were working on sexual behavior in the human male, but especially sexual behavior in the human female. But they weren't allowed to be on the cover. So the Kinsey scale revolutionized how scientists, especially within sexuality research, thought about sexuality. Suddenly it became a spectrum. And that's something we still talk about today, right? That sexuality is a spectrum, and this is the spectrum they're talking about. Now, what happened? We're going chronologically, right? So what happened on the 28th of June, 1969?
Stonewall.
You got this. Stonewall, very good. The Stonewall uprising, Stonewall riots, however you want to call them. This was the Village Voice, which was the local gay paper reporting on it. There's some really fun archive stuff from the time where you see the radically different portrayals of what was happening in the notoriously queer part of New York. And so it was weeks in the end of various repeated riots and repeated protests. And so at this point, there was a huge move to also fight for rights in a new way. Basically, there had been too many attacks by police on the queer community, and the queer community had had enough. And so that was a real deciding point, which obviously we still see the echoes this day. And so from that point on, bisexuals were, well, had a bit of a hard time. Because up until this point, we had Kinsey. It was all more fluid. The idea was basically lots of people are bisexual. Possibly most people are somewhere in the middle, aren't entirely hetero or homosexual, so are on the bisexual spectrum. And then suddenly this happens, and the problem is that they started writing to local politicians and saying, we want rights. We want rights, we want protections. You were allowed to openly discriminate against homosexual people. You're allowed to do all kinds of things. And they said, no, we want rights. And their governors would write back, again, correspondence that still exists, saying, yeah, but what about those bisexuals that you have? Because what's next? Marrying dogs? I mean, it was the same kind of argument that you heard for queer people in general. But bisexuality was seen as even more promiscuous and sexual. I mean, it even has sexual in the word. In fact, in the March on Washington, so this is the first Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day. So that's what it used to be called before we now call it Pride, because I think the attack happened on Christopher Street. Fun fact, in Germany, it's still called Christopher Street Day. So if you go for Pride, it's still called Christopher Street Day. So this is the first marches. And this woman here, see, right, I'm going to zoom out again, zoom in again, zoom out again, zoom in again. Yeah, that woman. Brenda Howard, known as the mother of Pride. Also, say it with me, bisexual. Very good. So Brenda Howard was one of the first people to organize the Pride marches and the subsequent Stonewall marches. And so, again, we've been there. Not many people talk about the fact that bisexual people helped with this. And yet, over the next 20 or so years, bisexual people were often crowded out because politicians weren't on board with basically the complexity of it. Never mind the idea of like ethical non-monogamy. And so it was a tense time for the bisexuals, and that's where we started to experience more of what we now refer to as double discrimination. Is that bisexual people felt like they were being crowded out, and they were being crowded out by some queer spaces, so they couldn't go there, and by heterosexual spaces. And so you end up being in this in-between where you're getting the hate from both sides because you're not gay enough to be over here and you're not straight enough to be over here. And that's really bad, of course, for things like mental health. Now, speaking of mental health, and let's talk about bi men. I mean, so far we've mostly talked about men because men were the researchers at this period. But here's a man, Fritz Klein, who wrote something called The Bisexual Option. It was a book, and it was specifically about bisexuality, but Fritz Klein, who was the researcher who wrote it, himself a bi man, he did community support groups, like group therapy, for bi men. That's how he started. He then ended up expanding into sort of bisexual affirmative therapy more generally. And there's some great quotes from his work, because he wrote about it a lot. And he'd give all these case studies where parents would drop off their, 17-year-olds and be like, fix this one. And he'd be like, mm-hmm. And then he'd be like, I affirm you. But basically, there was a lot of people who thought that he would fix or de-gay their kids, which of course was the opposite of what he wanted to do. What he wanted people to do is to align their sexual identity with their sexuality. And he called that, which is really nice, the happy bisexual. The happy bisexual is someone who feels and lives their bisexuality in whichever way that makes sense to them and identifies that way. And not someone who, for example, is having, let's say, sexual interactions with multiple genders, but identifies as straight and has a conflict. And so, as part of his therapy, he created this scale, which is actually my favorite. So Kinsey, you could see the Kinsey sort of in this, where there's still, he did 1 to 7 instead of 0 to 6, but it's the same idea. And again, he did it a bit hetero only to homosexual only, same as the Kinsey scale, but he added levels. And I love this, and I encourage you to do this because it's really fun. It's a really fun thing to do because it makes, what he wanted is he wanted to see on all of these different variables, are there conflict points? So is, let's say, sexual attraction in the past, maybe it was hetero mostly. Maybe in the present, it's gay lesbian mostly. And maybe the ideal is exactly in the middle. Or maybe your sexual behavior doesn't correspond with your ideal. Or maybe your sexual fantasies are totally different than your sexual reality. Or maybe your lifestyle. This was a real awakening for me when I did it the first time. I was like, I don't have enough queer friends. Which, again, if you're looking for pain points as to why you start to feel isolated and everyone around you doesn't quite get it, it's oh, my lifestyle is super het. I gotta go get some community. Hence, joining things like Bi Pride. And that made a really big difference for my well-being. And so he was trying to identify exactly these kinds of moments where he could say, I see that there's something going on here. Let's move you into your ideal. And this is a really nice thing. I mean, whatever your sexuality is, right? This can work. So this is not just for bisexuals. This is for anybody. And so he tried to deal with unhappy bisexuals, and he tried to make them more happy. So that was Fritz Klein. Now, we're a little bit further in time. That was the 70s. Again, talking about how bisexuals were getting crowded out of other spaces, so bisexual people were making their own. Hence, things like the bi community. Lani Kahumanu was the only and first bisexual speaker at the 1993 March on Washington, which was a big queer liberation moment as well. And this is her. I like her props. She used to identify, this is also a trajectory I like to mention because I think it's really important. Lani talks about herself as how she used to identify as lesbian and then identified as bi. And she found it at the time harder to identify as bi because there was more of a lesbian community. And so I think sometimes we see bi as the stepping stone to gay. And I think it's really important, to destroy that narrative. I mean, it can be for some people, fine. But I think we also need to remember that bi can also be after other identities. And so trying identities on for size and being able to say, actually right now, this is the thing that describes me the best. And not saying, well, because for the last 20 years I've called myself this, I now have to be this forever. Instead saying sexuality is fluid. So, my experience has changed. Maybe I had a singular same-sex attraction. Those always throw people. We're just like, I identify as this, and it's like, but you though. Those really throw people. And so I think Lani Kaumanu had this moment where she was like, I'm thrown by this man. Why am I liking this man? And so it was very much within her activism to also talk about the trajectories through queerness more generally. But she was the first person to speak. And my favorite thing about this is that around 1982, 1983, there's a whole question as to whether the B should be an LGB, right? Because the letters all added over time. And so the condition, because at this point it was gay, lesbian, right? It wasn't homosexual and heterosexual, or not heterosexual, but it wasn't homosexual. It was gay, lesbian. There's no sex in that, right? There's no sex in those words. And then it was bisexual. For shame. And so the condition literally was, we're not going to include it unless you remove the sexual. And so it was gay, lesbian, bi, or lesbian, gay, bi, because the sexual was too much. So she was speaking about bisexuality, but wasn't allowed to say the sex word, which I think is a fun fact. Also in 1993, this happens. And I threw this in for Adam Rutherford, who will be talking about genetics right after this talk. The gay gene was discovered, according to the press. A linkage between DNA markers on the X chromosome of male sexual orientation came out in Science. And XQ28 was identified. Such a sexy name. And the researchers said, well, actually, this specific XQ28 seems to be more prevalent in gay men than in people of other sexual orientations. And the press absolutely ran with it and was like, oh my God, we found the gay gene, which is, well, a very essentialist argument. So essentialism was very, very part of this time, where it was, you still hear it, that you're born gay. I was born this way, this is who I am, it can't be changed. And that was a politically clever thing to say, because immutable characteristics are the ones that we have rights for. Immutable characteristics put you in the category of protected characteristics, and we have templates for that. The problem is that it's not true. And so you could see how this article also really rang with the time. They're like, wow, amazing. Of course, other people were going, great, how do I get rid of this? Right? As soon as you have this kind of stuff, you have the dark side, where it's like, well, let's screen for this. Oh, well. And for the next, basically since this article came out and all the press around it, Hamer in particular, because his phone ran off the hook when this came out, all of this stuff was happening, and he's basically spent the next 30 years being like, there's no gay gene. He's regretted, not quite, but he regrets how it was picked up at the time, because he's like, that's not true. So there's been studies since which have found that actually you can't really identify at all genetically different sexualities from one another. So there's no gay gene. Obviously, when this came out, I also thought to myself, well, if there's a gay gene, do I have half a gay gene? What does it mean? The answer is it doesn't. And if anything, probably in the natural world, well, not probably, in the natural world, we see that most mammals engage in some bisexual behavior. So bisexuality seems to be the norm rather than abnormal, at least in terms of community behavior. Obviously, when you're having babies, that's a bit more limited. But in terms of how animals interact with one another, bisexuality seems to be the most adaptive strategy. So if anyone ever says things to you, you can say it's adaptive. And in 2020, just to bring it into now, right before I wrap up, if you have any questions, now's the time to start thinking about them. 2020, you might think, that was 1993, ages ago. Things have changed. We had social media. Miley Cyrus came out as pansexual 10 years ago. We've got representation now to some extent. And the answer is yes, we do, but we also have papers like this. This is a paper that I wrote a rebuttal to, very much in the style of Kinsey, where me and a bunch of bi men were like, wait, what? So what this says, here, let me find a quote for you. This is published in 2020 in PNAS, which is a reputable journal. This is the starting sentence. I'm just going to let you read that for a second. 2020. What is the problem with the sentence? It is wrong, is the problem with the sentence, and it presents it as if it's not wrong. obviously all the bisexual men in my community were like, what? We're not surprised that bisexuality exists, nor do we need some scientists to tell us that it does. And guess how these scientists tested it? These scientists decided that the only way to tell if men who say they're bi really are bi, which is a wild premise, by the way, because that's not how identity works, right? The only way to figure out whether the men who say they're bi are actually bi is to show them pornography and measure whether or not their penises get hard to various kinds of pornography, which is a very natural setting. That is something, a very good design, definitely won't be contaminated by anything. And they were like, hey, look, these guys who say they're bi actually do respond to male and female stimuli. Wild! Anyway, the rest of us were going, this is not, what is this? And critiquing the premise, which is this idea that you need to somehow scientifically prove a sexuality. But this is still happening, this kind of stuff. This isn't far in the past. Okay, very briefly. To fight biphobia, we can also have biphoria, which is, I don't want to leave you with sort of negative studies. I want to leave you with happiness and joy. I want to leave you as happy bisexuals, or at least knowing people who are happy bisexuals, hopefully. So this is one of the clients who went to Fritz Klein. I think this is a funny quote. So one of the parents who dropped off his daughter at the time to Fritz Klein, once he diversified into multiple genders, the dad was like, oh, that's a man here, a woman there. You can't live that way. You're one thing or you're another. And this is my favorite. That's the danger. Too much freedom. Can't have bisexuals. They're too free. But I do think that freedom is a great word for how a lot of people feel about their own bisexuality. It's the freedom to love beyond gender. And research from positive psychology, which has asked bisexual people and plurisexual people, so people within the bi umbrella, what their favorite parts of being bi are. Freedom is the word that comes up the most. Freedom to love beyond gender, freedom to maybe also try different relationship structures, because if you're constantly being asked things like, can you really be monogamous? You might start wondering, well, there are other options. And so you start asking questions that maybe other people aren't prompted to ask as much. So I like freedom as a word. Doesn't mean that other people aren't free. It's just that bisexuality can be a specific kind of freedom within this. In terms of how to improve bi inclusion, there's 3 things you can do basically immediately. One, recognize that there's something called hypersexualization of women in particular. So when you see representation of women who are bi, don't say things like they're greedy or she probably whatever. Don't sexualize. Just let the woman be bi. Understand the bi penalty, which is that there is still, within work contexts, it's harder to come out for a lot of people as bi because it's associated with threesomes and orgies, basically. And so if you come out as bi, there's still this like, why are you telling me about your sex life kind of perception. So understanding that, you don't need to ask the questions. Like someone comes out as gay, you don't ask them, are you sure? We don't do that, and just don't do that with bis. Not that I feel like this group would do that anyway. And then be explicitly accepting of bisexuality. For example, in my family recently, we had someone who was married to a man and has now married a woman. How does everyone talk about her? As lesbian, correct. What is she probably? Bi, correct. You can, if you're not sure, just say lesbian or bi. Just add it in. And that just includes more identities. And that's all I've got for you. So once again, I leave you with the Hermann Hesse quote, I gave myself up to the ecstasy of discovery.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. I recommend you buy the book. It's on the bookstore. It's available on Kindle. I am very happy to say if I was interviewed by Kinsey, I would be 6, or I would tell him I was 6. But I did the Klein grid scoring. Julia encourages you as you read the book to stop and do the scoring for yourself. I was surprised. Anyway, questions? Questions? Hands up. There we go. The lady in the front here, please, Donna. Thank you.
Thank you for your very lively talk. Am I to understand that one could only be bisexual if one has a sexual response to both sexes, and that if you simply love people of either sex, you are not bisexual?
No, so bisexuality is usually defined as a sexual or romantic attraction to multiple genders. So it's and or. So you can have sexual response or you can have romantic response. Some even have other categories within that, but the big ones are sexual or romantic. So falling in love with a person of people of multiple genders also counts as bisexual. I mean, I really like everyone calling themselves bi. So I like the definition being as broad as possible. We need queer allies. But yes, but it is both sexual or romantic.
I always understood it that bisexual was to do with sex and bigender was to do with your identity. But you're talking about bisexual identity, so now I'm old and confused.
So bisexuality is an identity like lesbian or gay. And you mean by gender? So that's more within the gender. So bisexuality is whom I'm attracted to. And by gender, which is, or being maybe, forgotten the term. Non-binary. There it is.
Thank you.
Being non-binary is different again, because that's how you identify. So you can be gay and non-binary, for example. Sorry? Oh, that's a question that I don't know the answer to, but I would just expect yes. I mean, bigender isn't really a term that's used very much anymore, at least in sort of popular culture. But non-binary is how that you identify as non-binary, which is your gender. And then who you're attracted to is the other bit. So one is like, who am I? And the other is who am I attracted to? Does that help?
Thank you.
So my question is, the numbers that you gave of the amount of people, the percentage that aren't out of the bi closet was astonishing.
Yeah.
But what percentage of that do you think is not a result of people being inauthentic or people being scared to come out of the closet versus people who don't necessarily know because they might fall lower on the Kinsey scale, they might have a preference more towards heterosexuality, and they don't realize that they're indeed bisexual?
So these studies looked at people who identified as bi, so that omits sort of people who wouldn't call themselves bi already. And so amongst people who have adopted that specific label, they say this. But your question is a very good one, which is how many people have never considered that they might be able to use the term bisexual or think of themselves in this way because they don't feel like they're not so obviously a 3 on the Kinsey scale, basically. They're not like right in the middle. And so maybe they've had like occasional attractions to one gender, but they're mostly the other. And I think that number is enormous. And
And also you're saying it's not necessarily fixed. Like you can kind of slide along the scale. Like I don't know I like jelly donuts until I try a jelly donut.
Indeed. You should all try a jelly donut one time. just like take a look. Just like browse.
Browse
You
the
never know.
donut. Yes. Thank you. Donna.
So, I'm a straight woman who has quite a lot of gay and bi friends. And on the little table with the 7 rows and the 3 columns, you'd said, oh, you did that, and then you found out you'd have been better off if you'd have developed more of a gay social life. Because, are you saying I'm going to be happier if I develop a solely straight social life because I'm a straight woman with... Is that making me miserable? Because I don't think so.
No, but the point of the scale is to find points, because remember, the context is, I feel like something's wrong. And so so with Klein as well, people would come to therapy because they feel like there's concerns about their queerness, right? So the starting point is, I have questions about my sexuality.
So because I don't have questions about my sexuality, because my sexuality is the most acceptable, it's not causing me mental stress. Whereas if the coin was flipped, it would be. Is that what we're saying? That's why I would then need to get to grips with a gay social life.
Well, it's not that all the numbers need to align all the time either. It's
Right.
just a tool to help you think about it in a more complex way than just being like, what is my identity and am I living that?
It's just that to me, the logical flip side of what you were saying was that as a straight person, having gay friendships would somehow not be good for me, which is just bonkers.
Which is not what I was trying to say with that. But I do think, speaking to the straights in the room, it is still interesting to think about your sexuality. Like, just because you identify as straight, it doesn't mean, right, you can't still ask yourself questions about, like, because I know a lot of unhappy straights.
Yeah.
So, like, you can ask yourself, where's it coming from? And it's like, whether you're queer or not queer, I think there are questions within that. But it's just supposed to structure your thinking. It's not going to answer sort of, where do these thoughts come from?
Terry, there's a lady just there. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I'm a bisexual woman, and I've been married to a man for nearly 20 years, and we're in a monogamous relationship. In terms of that business of coming out, I came out long before I met him, and I've spoken on radio about being bisexual in Ireland in 1992. I mean, It's not like I've been like hiding or in the closet, but I constantly have, people always assume I'm straight. Even my queer friends assume I'm straight because I'm married to a man. And I think that's one of the things I find very difficult, is about having that sense of community without having to say, yes, that means I'm going to have sex with lots of different people, because I don't have any interest in having sex with anybody else, not because I've become straight, but because I'm happily monogamous.
And that bi-erasure and bi-invisibility is a major problem that's mentioned in the literature. So if you ask by people in general, especially when they're in mixed-sex relationships, but even if they're in same-sex relationships, because most people are in a relationship, if they're in one at all, with one person. And so as a bisexual person, that almost immediately, unless you have other ways of like communicating that you're bi, erases you being read as bi. And so this is actually a really big problem in film, is that there's often this question of like, how do we represent the bisexual? And it's like you have to either have them say something or mention an ex that's a different gender, or have them in a polyamorous relationship, because otherwise, unless they say the word, which is now becoming more of a thing, luckily, that people are starting to actually say bi, it was hard to read characters that way. But research on like bi moms, that's one of the big frustrations, is that you keep getting lumped in with where you're like, no, I'm part of the queer moms as well. Like I'm in this other space, but I also belong here. And you keep getting sort of pushed over there, because if you have a male partner. And so that can be a very distressing experience. I also have a male partner, and there's different ways of doing it. So for me, it's also like in my house, I have like references to bisexuality. You can buy a book and put it in your bookshelf.
Very good. Thank you. Well, buy your book. Let's say thank you to Julia again.